Okay, so yeah, we're going to mess with some passages today that sort of highlight or illustrate our synoptic problem issue. And I'm going to have three groups of us in three different spaces of the Gospels looking at some different material. Good so far? Okay, so the five of you over here, I need you to go to Matthew chapter 9, okay? The four of you, right? So you three in that middle row and Alex appears, right? So you four, I need you to go to Mark chapter 5, and then my friends in the back, right? The four of you in the back, go to Luke chapter 8. Matthew 9, verses 18 to 26 will be our focal point. Mark 5, 21 to 43. Okay. And Luke 8, 40 to 56. Does that make sense? So those are your verse numbers for what we're looking at. We're going to use Mark's gospel as a guidepost. Okay. And we're going to go piece by piece in this. And I'm just going to try and illustrate for you what we're talking about with the synoptic problem. Okay, so Matthew 9, 18 to 26, Mark 5, 21 through 43, and Luke 8, 40 through 56. Good? Okay, we're going to use Mark. We're going to use Mark in this case, okay, and use the text of Mark's gospel. We're going to go sort of a verse at a time and then compare. All right? So somebody with Mark, begin in verse 21. Do a little reading for me.
When Jesus had again crossed over by the boat to the other side of the lake, and a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake, then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet.
Okay, pause there. So now we're at the beginning of Mark, chapter 5, verse 23. When Jesus had crossed again by boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him beside the sea. Is any of that information in Matthew's verse 18? Nope, doesn't appear at all. Is any of that in Luke verse 40? Kind of, right? Like when he returned, and then it's the crowd welcomed him, they gathered around him. That's it. So Mark at this point has more details about this storyline. Yes? But they're all telling the same story. So we're illustrating what we're going to talk about. Okay, so then verse 22. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue. Anything in Matthew verse 18? A ruler came and knelt before him. Well, we're not told he's a ruler of the synagogue. We're just told he's a ruler, right? Okay. And he fell at Jesus' feet. Matthew says he kneels down or whatever before him. 41 of Luke, there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue, and he fell at Jesus' feet. Oh, so that's a lot more like Mark's, isn't it? Oh. Are you beginning to see what we're talking about? Okay, here's how it's going to progress. I'll pick up in 23 of the Gospel of Mark. Okay? So this synagogue leader falls at his feet and beseeches him. He says, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. What does Matthew say? My daughter has just died. So it seems like Matthew's storyline might be in a different place. We're going to talk about that in a second. Okay? Does Luke have any of the dialogue from this character? No, it's not there. It just says, right? he's asking Jesus to come to his house because he has a daughter who's 12 and she was dying. But there's no speech from Jairus. Okay? Mark continues, come lay your hands on her so that she might be well and live. It's the same thing in Matthew, right? Come lay your hand on her so she might be well and live. None of that is in Luke. Right? All right, so verse 24. And he went with him. Verse 19 in Matthew, Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. Okay. 24. A great crowd followed him and thronged around him. And there was a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years. That is in Matthew, right? Behold, a woman who had suffered from a hemorrhage for 12 years. Luke, and a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years. So that details in all three. Okay. She had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better but grew worse. Luke, flow of blood for 12 years, could not be healed by anyone. You with me so far? 27 in the Gospel of Mark says this. She heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd. All three Gospels have that. And touched his garment. Matthew and Luke have touched the fringe of his garment. Okay. For she said to herself, this is in Mark and in Matthew now, if I only touch the hem of his garment, I will be made well. Luke doesn't have any of what she says to herself in it. It's not there in Luke. Okay? What is there is immediately her bleeding ceased, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Luke just says immediately she's made well. Right? Okay. Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned to the crowd and said, Who touched my garment? Luke, he says, who touched me? It's the same question. His disciple said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? In Luke, Peter says, Master, the multitude surround you and press on you. There's no question, it's just a statement. But both are part of the dialogue. Okay, so we carry on. He looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had been done to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Luke says, Jesus said, someone touched me. I perceive power has gone out from me. None of that's in Mark. None of that's in Matthew. And then we get the woman who comes up and presents herself. Does that make sense? Okay. So then Luke has some added details about this interaction between Jesus and the woman that Mark has left out. Matthew doesn't have any of this information. Instead, Matthew goes straight from she being convinced that if she touches his garments, she's going to be made well, to what Jesus says to her. The action that's taken place, and Jesus being like, hey, wait, somebody touched me, and all the interaction that goes along with that, Matthew's just left it all out. He goes straight from the woman and her actions to what Jesus has to say to her. Mark and Luke focus on the interactions of the crowd and the people and what's happening around Jesus. Highlighting some of the different focal points. Okay. So Jesus said, right? He said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Be healed of your disease. Right? Matthew just says, daughter, your faith has made you well. And that's like the end of the statement. And then Matthew adds, and instantly the woman was made well. Notice in Matthew, she's not healed until Jesus speaks. So here's one of those unique focal points for the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew tends to highlight and focus on things Jesus has to say. And things happen, things occur, things change after Jesus speaks. Where Luke and Mark tend to focus on the action of the storyline and what Jesus does. Yeah? Or specific things Jesus will say to certain people, like the Gospel of Luke will focus on. Okay, So then Mark continues in verse 35. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house someone who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But ignoring what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." This is pretty consistent, Mark and Luke, right? It's the same stuff. Matthew doesn't have any of this. Are you with me? So here's one of the ideas. When the encounter starts between Jesus and Jairus, the daughter is dead in Matthew. She's already died. But in Mark and Luke, she's at the point. She's almost dead. Yeah? Matthew seems to start his story in the middle, after the daughter has died. Does that make sense? And then talk about the woman, and then go to the house and heal the daughter. Mark and Luke start way back before that, at the coastline on the Sea of Galilee. She's not yet dead, then she is dead in the middle, and then he's going to fix it. Does that make sense? So there's different starting points for the storylines here. Okay. Verse 37, he allowed no one to follow him except for Peter and James and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, okay, he saw the tumult. In Matthew, it's specific. He saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he entered the house, he said to them, "Why do you make such a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." He says that in all three Gospels. She's not dead, just asleep. And in all three Gospels, they laugh at him. He put them outside. He took the father and the mother and those who were with him, and he went in to where the child was, and taking her by the hand, he said, Talitha Kumi, which means little girl, I say to you, arise. In Matthew, he just takes her by the hand and she gets up. He doesn't say anything, which is ironic for Matthew, who's always highlighting what Jesus has to say. But that might have more to do with the fact that Matthew wasn't inside. It's just Peter, James, and John. Okay? In Luke, we get everything except the Aramaic. We don't get that phrase. We just get it in Greek, right? Okay. Immediately the girl got up and she's fine. Is it the same story in all three Gospels? It's even the same interruption in all three Gospels, right? But are they unique presentations of the same thing? Even when they're word for word. Matthew's focus is on Jesus and what he has to say. Mark's focus is on big picture. This is the storyline and this is what's transpiring. And Luke's focus is on how Jesus interacts with the world around him. Right? And so you have the same material, you have the same stuff, you have the same stories, but they look different. They look nuanced. They look unique to the focal point of that author. Are you with me on this? Take out some notes. I want to do some basics of the Synoptic Gospels. And then we'll go from there. How about that? Okay. Thematic emphasis in the Synoptics. In other words, there are themes each gospel is going to focus on. There are points of emphasis each gospel is going to have. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke have unique emphasis points. Okay? So, Matthew's focal point is consistently Jesus. That sounds totally ridiculous to say. It's a gospel. It's about Jesus. Duh, he's focusing on Jesus. But I think we highlighted it here in this storyline. Mark and Luke take time to tell you the storylines that are going on around Jesus, where Matthew doesn't. Matthew just focuses on Jesus, on what he's doing, and on what he's saying. And so one of Matthew's consistent points of emphasis is Jesus. What Jesus does and what Jesus says. And he will pay less attention to surrounding characters and action and more attention to what's going on with Jesus. Is that making sense? So he doesn't spend as much time talking about the woman. He doesn't spend as much time with Jesus' interaction with the crowds or with the comments from Peter and the other disciples. He just focuses on what Jesus has to say. And so something like the woman's healing in Matthew's gospel, you're only told she's made well after Jesus interacts with the woman, not before. Where Mark and Luke tell you immediately she's good, right? Because the focus in Matthew has to do with Jesus. Everything's going to highlight something about Jesus. It seems the more major emphasis for Matthew in his gospel is on what Jesus has to say. Okay? We'll talk more about this when we get into the specifics of the Gospel of Matthew, but major emphasis is on what Jesus has to say. Good so far? Okay. Mark. I said the other day, Matthew's kind of like the documentary and Mark's kind of like the action movie. Because Mark's focused on the action. Mark has no birth story narrative. He just jumps right in with Jesus getting baptized. Jumps straight into the ministry and has a gospel that's only 16 chapters. It's the shortest of them all. And Jesus moves really, really, really quickly from the start of his ministry to his crucifixion and resurrection. There's very little time, it seems, if you read the story, that passes from the moment he starts to the moment he dies. It just goes. 16 chapters, and I think 11 of those chapters are committed to Jesus before the last week of his life, and chapters 12 through 16 are committed to the last week of his life and after his resurrection. Think about that for a second. A third of the gospel is dedicated to 1 week in the life of Jesus, and 2/3 of it are dedicated to the rest of his life. Mark's got an emphasis. It's the action stuff. Part of that action, though, for Mark is what we will call Passion Week. It's the last week of Jesus' life, from triumphal entry to Good Friday to Easter Sunday. Okay? Mark wants to get us to the Passion Week in the life of Jesus, and he's going to get us there quickly. Good? So he focuses on the action. He focuses on the events that involve the woman. He focuses on the events that involve Jairus. He focuses on the events that involve the crowd and the harp players and the extra and the stuff, yeah? Matthew doesn't. It's just locked in on what's going on with Jesus. It's the solo camera, right? It's tracking Jesus. Everything Jesus does, that's what he's following. Mark is watching it all play out and is telling you about the action that's happening. Okay? Luke. Luke's gospel seems to be more concerned thematically with the interactions with Jesus. Matthew's locked in on Jesus. He's going to follow that. That's his solo camera feed. Mark is surveying the whole thing. He's telling you the whole story. There's more action involved. It's the whole package. And Luke is paying attention to how this character and Jesus are interacting, to how Jesus and that character are interacting. And he's sort of guiding you through the story by showing you Jesus' interactions. Especially when those interactions happen with people that would be on the outskirts of society. The sick, the marginalized, the disenfranchised, women and children, that kind of thing. Is it making sense? These emphasis points are how we end up with the same story, the woman with the issue of blood and Jairus' daughter, being told so uniquely? Because it's the same set of material. It's the same storyline, but there's variation in the details. Matthew includes this detail, the others don't. Mark and Luke talk about the action and the interactions around him. Matthew just focuses on what Jesus has to say, etc. Is this making sense to you guys? Okay. Questions on this synoptic problem stuff and questions on how this works? And no, you okay? All right. The game plan. Okay. The game plan for the rest of today is I'm going to give you some time to work on your stuff. All right. For your exam and to work on your memory verses. There's 2 of them that are due next week. Okay, they're posted to Power School. All right. So work on those. Tomorrow, I'll have an in-class activity for us to work through and work on. And then time remaining can be dedicated to some of that other stuff as well. Questions or concerns? Okay.